discussing today issues of importance for our Nordic collaboration from different angles, and not least about the sea that we are traveling back and forth. And one important aspect that we have addressed during the day and that we will focus on here is our current situation of information, or rather disinformation, or the so-called infodemic that we are right in now, still as a result of COVID-19. So one big idea is that we would like to discuss how and if it's possible to counter the so-called infodemic, and if it is possible and how it would be possible to detox our lead narratives. And I'm very happy to have with me my colleague Kasper Grotle Rasmussen from Denmark. He will say a few words about himself later, and I will start off with a short thematic introduction. So the viral dissemination of dis and misinformation has been branded a global infodemic. Toxic conspiracy theories have invaded our minds. But is it possible to create counter-narratives of hope? So the COVID-19 pandemic has uncovered the vulnerability of knowledge in times of crisis. In order to explain to people why the crisis happens, but also to deliberately manipulate us, since the outset of the pandemic in 2020, a number of meaning-making narratives have been disseminated. The WHO speaks about the infodemic, a viral dissemination of misleading information, which makes it hard for people to understand the seriousness of the disease and what is needed to combat it. What I would like to discuss today is if and how we can return to new lead narratives in which we aren't turned into victims of circumstances, but creators of our future. Is it possible to turn the tide and to counter perceptions of conspiracy? How can we distinguish between true and false and receive a better understanding of a good life? And what are the possible elements of creative counter-narratives? So with these words, I again would like to welcome Kasper Grotle Rasmussen. Most welcome to our discussion here today. So would you like to introduce yourself to start with?
I would, thank you, and thank you very much for having me. So my name is Kasper Grotle Rasmussen, and I'm an associate professor of American history at the University of Southern Denmark in Odense, in Denmark. So here one of my main sort of areas of research is conspiracy theories, both in the United States, but also in Denmark, and particularly in the Nordic countries. So I'm very much sort of interested in how these ideas, such as the conspiracy theories, how they travel and how they have traveled, indeed, from or between Europe and the United States, and how we're sort of very much, perhaps right now, influenced by a certain sort of conspiracy culture or conspiracy ideas from the United States.
Thank you so much. In front of me, there is a book that we have collaborated on, Kasper, and you were sort of one of the main editors trying to keep us, a group of Nordic authors, together in an approach to trying to cover conspiracy theories and the Nordic countries. Tell our audience a little bit about the book and what the rationale of the book is and what they can expect from reading it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this book is sort of comes to fruition, or came to fruition, through a conspiracy theory research network, a fairly large one we had with other European countries. I think we were about 200 researchers in total over about a 4-year period, where we discussed conspiracy theories in Europe, in the United States, and different parts of the world. And I think one of the sort of central premises about conspiracy theories has always been that they really exist in times of crises, in unstable environments, or in periods where there's a lot of disagreement among groups in different countries. And so we, in a sort of self-appointed Nordic group where we worked on other things, we sat around and sort of discussed, there's a lot of people that think that there can't be any conspiracy theories in the Nordic region. I mean, because we are sort of rich, prosperous, stable welfare states. Um, but we all had sort of coming from the region had a very strong inkling that there were and had always been and were also conspiracy theories in this particular region, but nobody had ever actually examined it, and nobody had examined it sort of cross-regionally across the Nordic region. So we sat down, we wanted to write a book that was not sort of an anthology. So it's not a collection of sort of individual or chapters written individually by us, but rather it's a book with sort of coherent chapters that cover the different countries. So trying to sort of cover the region as a whole, in different thematic areas.
Mm. Yeah, and what brought you to the table, so to speak? What made you tick? You were discussing before you associate professor of American culture. What makes you work? What do you find is particularly interesting when working with conspiracy theories?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, so I think I have two things that I might I have brought to the table. One of them is that I'm looking for sort of the American heritage, if you will. So the conspiracy theories that this Nordic region kind of adopted from the United States. What I find is interesting there is that the conspiracy theories in the United States, they, came about in a completely different cultural and historical setting. It's a much younger country than ours, and it has a completely different history and different creation, both creation myths and actual creation stories. So how can you take some of these same conspiracy theories and sort of transplant them into into a completely different setting? So I thought that was very interesting because I had seen over the last 20 or 30 years, looking back throughout history, that there had been a very sort of serious American influence in Danish conspiracy theories. So I thought that was very interesting. And I think the other thing that I think most of us share, but I don't think that we all sort of completely agree on, is this, what is the role of conspiracy theories in a society? So, can conspiracy theories actually also tell us something good, something worthwhile? Can they be this kind of analytical lens that we can see society through, or are they simply, elements that need to be eradicated because they are dangerous? So I think they're a bit of both, and I think, for analyzing the status of, where are we as a society, kind of using them as a barometer to look at what do different groups think about society right now. I think conspiracy theories are great in that particular respect. But I also think that there are really sort of inherent dangers in conspiracy theories and what they can do, particularly in this era of a pandemic, to public health, but also to sort of the state of our democracy.
Indeed, and my next question would be like, when we had been working on the book, COVID-19 hit our part of the world as well, and what were the reactions in Denmark? If you can summarize that in a few sentences, like how did people react upon the pandemic from the perspective of what we have been talking about here, like, for instance, knowledge, trust in society, counter movements, and so on?
So I think you might need to repeat that question just for once. Right. I think the connection just a little bit.
Okay, my question was, if you look at it from the Danish perspective, the time we are in right now, what was the reaction when it comes to disinformation, conspiracy theories, and COVID-19 in Denmark? How is your take on that?
Yeah, so this is of course really interesting, and this is one of the things. I mean, there were two important elements that we didn't really get in the book. One was sort of, you know, the sudden rapid spread of this most American of conspiracy theories, QAnon, that did really spread to Europe over the last year. We didn't really get that because we'd finished writing the book already. And then the second was, of course, that the pandemic hit, and we couldn't get that in either. But I do think that what the book does is really, you can read it as kind of a precursor to what then happened. Because one of the things that we argue in the book is that the different Nordic countries did also, or have reacted differently to conspiracy theories throughout history, and this was also true during the pandemic. And I think that the two countries perhaps most alike, in history at least, would probably be Denmark and Sweden, because they had sort of similar statuses. Throughout history, they've been fairly the most powerful of the Nordic five, and so we can compare them to some extent. But what happened during the pandemic, of course, was that Denmark and Sweden had completely different takes on what was about to happen. So there was a fairly harsh lockdown in Denmark, and there was a less or more lenient lockdown in Sweden, and this really affected the way that the public sort of saw this. So in the beginning, in sort of the spring, when the lockdown started, everybody sort of rallied round the flag, almost, to sort of use an American metaphor, in Denmark, and most people accepted fairly harsh sort of lockdown procedures, and everybody thought, well, this is a fairly good idea. But then, as some of these consequences started seeping in, so there was bills passed in Parliament that gave very sort of wide authority to the Minister of Health, for instance, and a number of people started reacting to this. In the fall, other sort of authority was added to that, but also there was the so-called mink scandal, in which all mink in Denmark were destroyed because everybody was afraid that they might pass on the virus. So this sort of led to conspiracy theories that the government was in fact doing this on purpose, which is of course one of the central elements of a conspiracy theory, that everything is planned. And then the second element, that everything is connected, that then the government must, be in league with international forces that are kind of, that have designed this from the beginning. So then, ideas about this global health, this global pandemic exercise, Event 201, that happened in Washington in the fall of 2019, so before the pandemic had sort of broken out, said, well, this is actually where they gamed out everything. This was the simulation for the entire worldwide pandemic, and this was where every government on earth got their marching orders. When in reality, this was a simulation exercise that came because there'd been other pandemics, in the last 10 or 15 years, swine flu pandemic, Zika virus, and others. So you wanted to have sort of a global preparedness. But because the governments have been fairly, and especially the government in Denmark, has been fairly closed off in its sort of decision making, hasn't been very transparent, then some of these conspiracy theories, see the light of day, and they begin to develop, not just among a very, very small part of the population, but actually among a larger part of the population that are against some of the other things that are happening, especially, of course, this mink scandal of last fall.
Yeah, I mean, and from the beginning, one could assume that this was a spine reaction of the countries. The harder the lockdown, the harder the reactions against the lockdown, also in terms of conspiracy theories and ideas about the deep state wanting to take control of. So, but also Sweden got its own anti-corona movement. So it seems that this crisis in particular has kind of forged different alliances across the conspiratorial spectrum. Is that also the case in Denmark, that you could see new alliances between, let's say, very right-wing people, very left-wing people, greenish activists and anti-vaxxers and so on? Or how did the opposition to COVID-19 among the conspiratorial spectrum look like in your country?
So to some extent, but I think what's been interesting. So to some extent, that's true, right? That the far right, or the sort of relatively far right, joined forces with the relative sort of far left in opposing government government lockdown procedures, and sort of saying this is all part of a greater plan. But at the same time, we've also seen that the very far right, and we write about this in our book, because there was a very far right politician, Rasmus Paludan, from what was called Hardline, the party at the time, tried to get into parliament 2 years ago. And he didn't get in, but he had a very strong showing, and almost sort of made the threshold. And he sort of tried to get in league with the most sort of visible pandemic protesters, or conspiracy protesters, the group in Denmark called Men in Black, that has also been exported to Sweden, and they, blankly, they sort of denied, saying you don't have anything to do here. So there's also been sort of a separation, sort of a social control within the conspiratorial ecosystem, if you will, which I do think is rather interesting, because otherwise you could have sort of said, well, the enemy of my enemy will be my friend. But they very clearly said we don't want anything to do with this.
Yeah, it's an interesting case, actually. I think there's lots of more research to be done, because our book was written right into this scenario, which was both challenging and interesting, and we leave lots of things to do for the future. Today, as we are sailing on this ship of a new story, of course, and many people, maybe you have also been in the media, Casper, I know in Denmark you have been asked, and we are asked as experts on the situation. I have received many times over the last year the question, what can we do about these narratives? Because obviously they're kind of toxic to democracy, as our colleague Chip Burley has called it. What is your take on that? As first of all, what do you think about what we as researchers could do in order to contribute to such narratives, and how does the discussion go in Denmark with that, or is there any discussion about the toxicity of these narratives, and if it is necessary to counter them? What is your impression?
Yeah, there's a very strong discussion going on at the moment about what should you do? Should you go out and so-called debunk? Basically look at what's being said and then say, well, this isn't true. And I think that's definitely one of the things that we have to do. We have to sort of insist on saying that, well, we have a way of producing knowledge and through sort of academic research, and when we encounter something that we say, well, this doesn't really meet those standards, we do have an obligation to say that is not the case. But I also think that there are a couple of things that we need to address here. So one is that, can conspiracy theories be a positive value? Can they have a positive value in democracy? So I guess one of the positive values in democracy can be to sort of say, you can try and you can make the power structures, or the powers to be, you can make them aware that there's actually quite a lot of disagreement and dissent. There's a lot of the conspiracy theories function as kind of a valve for this sort of political dissent, and I do think that is important. I think that's something that politicians should listen to. But on the other hand, so there's a couple of things I think we can do to sort of counter these kinds of narratives, and then none of them are actually easy. So I think first of all, if I could just the sort of three things. The first is that politicians really need to consider their transparency. They really need to consider sort of being open and as honest as possible with, with the population. I think that's one thing. The media has to avoid sensationalism at all costs, because that doesn't help. Then you can just say, well, everything is fake news, because they engage in clickbait and other things on social media. And then I think the third thing that we really all need to do is, whether it's in education system or just in your daily life, you need to develop better tools of source criticism, particularly when you are dealing with stuff online. So really be critical about what is coming out and what you yourself are putting out there. So I think those are some of the things that we can do to counter these narratives.
Are these initiatives going on in Denmark right now, or are you involved in some of these projects, or kind of trying to turn the tide, or?
No, so there's from our colleague who's also a big part of the book, Asbjørn Dyrendal, in Norway. So he has a large school project which is sort of ongoing and just beginning, where you're starting to sort of look at. First, we have to analyze sort of the problem, saying what are we actually doing here. But the other part, and that's a sort of a more long-sighted look. And then, I whenever I'm interviewed about these things, I say these three things that are actually necessary and we all need to do.
Yes.
The other thing is that I really think we need to open up our knowledge to society, just like we're doing right now, and going out, doing public lectures and talking, addressing these things, and talking to a public that's very interested in all of these things. And sometimes they're skeptical, and I think they should be skeptical about the way in which power is dealt with. But then we can, give them our insight.
Absolutely. I was thinking about that as well, and I was thinking about if we were talking about, for instance, the openness and transparency that we are asking for when it comes to politicians, and we have been talking about previously. Today we had two Swedish, one Danish, one Swedish politician here in our program, talking about the Nordic new normal and so on. In what sense do you think that disinformation and conspiracy theories are part of an enhanced crisis responsiveness between the Nordic countries? Is that something that we should look at the Nordic level, or would you feel that we need to have a more national or even local approach to these issues? What do you feel about that?
I think to an extent, I think you need an approach on all levels. So you need a local level. You need to actually, in local housing projects and others, you really need to go out and see, because there's a lot of disinformation, a lot of conspiracy theorizing going on, especially among the younger demographics, the younger age group. And nationally, you definitely need to address these things. You need to address them in schools. You need to address them as a government. But I also do think that the Nordic level can hold, a good, can have a very good place, a good role to play here. That's something, because these initiatives are crossing borders. We just talked about how there's a lot of things crossing, especially here in the Öresund region where you are right now. Right, between Denmark and Sweden, there's a lot of things going on. So a Nordic level could definitely address some of these issues. Also, because we need to consider the fact that some of the conspiracy theories are sort of born global or born international. Particularly the one that we've been talking about a lot, Andreas. This with the Great Reset, this idea that there's a sort of new world order dealing with this. There are very prominent Danes and Swedes in this so-called World Freedom Alliance,
exactly.
and also a lot of Germans. So these things are going on across borders.
Yes, indeed. And I was thinking about how this is also transnationally organized and transnationally disseminated. I think that the pandemic is a case, in fact, that crisis responsiveness on the level of the cognitive dimension also does not stop on the national borders, but transgresses the transnational borders, and that this is also a special field that we need to analyze. It's not only that we are exposed to more, say, disinformation from other actors like China or Russia. It's also that people get their information more in an international milieu where they build up, civil society organizations like World Freedom Alliance, where this information suddenly is shared. And I think it's therefore it's also not wise that that countering these narratives is left on the national level. We need to talk about it as an international phenomenon, and I think that is what you show in the book, for instance, when you talk about the dissemination of 9/11 conspiracy theories, where there is a similar pattern. So I wrote a report for the Swedish Civil Contingency Agency, as you might know, Casper, and they asked me, like, what can we do? How can we counter? And I think we could spend the last 5 minutes on kind of talking a little bit about that, because when I talk about these things, I say always that conspiracy theories are meaning-making narratives, and that we should understand them as thus. And I made a little table with like 12 elements of what conspiracy theories are and how you can identify them. And I was thinking about, is it possible to counter them somehow? So if you have 12 elements that you can, identify conspiracy theory, could you use this knowledge in producing a counter narrative? And as you know, I mean, we're talking about patterns and plans and plots and so on. For instance, my idea was here to say, okay, instead of seeing patterns, maybe questioning where you get your information from, instead of thinking of that you are controlled by others on a map, can we give people a compass instead of just assuming that the world is black and white? How can we encourage multiplicity and so multiple perspectives? And I don't know if you have been thinking about it in this direction as well, and therefore my question goes to you, so to speak, more tentatively. How do you think we can get there? I mean, you're talking about the transparency on the side of the politicians, the media who have to avoid the sensationalism, the education system that has to develop source criticism. But on the level of, I mean, these narratives are a mix between cognitive elements and personality traits and worldviews. So where do you think that we will come the easiest forward with? Because there are different guides out there, but what is your personal take? What do you think we should focus on?
I think we should, focus on, and this will be particularly sort of in the level of education, of our sort of public guide, just like you wrote this report that became public, and sort of giving people the tools to actually counter these things. And I do think that so the formal school system is very good, and I think that it has a very good place. But I also think that we need really to talk to civil organizations, talk to cultural organizations, go out and meet people, or help educate the people that are actually meeting them out in the communities. So we have, there is a place for that sort of larger, either at the Nordic or the national level to put these things out there. But I do really think I like your the sort of the 12 elements where we can really get down to it and have it become more practical. And I think that's sometimes what's necessary, right? Give examples, say, what's happening, this, that, and the other way. And then also be open about the fact that, power has sometimes in history, many times in history, been corrupted, and has many times done things that essentially the conspiracy theorists are accusing it of. But that doesn't mean that there's a huge conspiracy and that every bad element going forward should be analyzed within the narrative of that particular conspiracy. So I think some of that is, I think that's one of the ways forward.
Great. Wonderful. Well, we have already come to the end of our session, Casper. So let me try to summarize what we've been talking about. First, we started to talk about our book and why we wrote it, and then we moved into asking a question: what can be done? You were calling for more transparency and more, you know. Media should be more critical about what they are publishing. We're talking about educational systems and how to turn the tide of the negative narratives. But most definitely, what we are asking for is that we want to develop forums where research can talk to civil society and stakeholders in a better and more effective way. Maybe one could talk about that, because as we know, it takes years to produce a scientific study or a book, but we need to be more responsive. And then also what I take away from our discussion, Casper, is that we need to take to these, if we see conspiracy theories as a problem, a cognitive problem in crisis responsiveness, then we need to tell our stakeholders and politicians that if you want to develop crisis responsiveness that goes across borders, you need to take conspiracy theories into account when countering and when designing and managing crises such as COVID-19, because there will be more crises in the future, and let's be better prepared, so to speak. So with that being said, do you want to have a final word, Casper?
Yeah, I'd like to just, to end on, I think, a message of almost sort of peace and understanding. Just saying that I think that in order for this to work, you need all groups to function together. So you need those, that are in favor of conspiracy theories and those who think they're a bad idea to actually meet. So what this needs is that we stop stigmatizing, particularly that we stop stigmatizing people that believe in conspiracy theories, and rather embrace them and have a meaningful discussion. So essentially, stop talking about tinfoil hats.
Yes.
I think would be my advice going forward.
That, I think it's a wonderful last word, and thank you so much for being with us, Casper, and enjoy your day. Thank you. Bye bye.
Thank you very much. Enjoy your trip.